In 1721, a patrol ship found a trading brig drifting in the Mediterranean, no crew aboard. The holds were full of silk and spice, the sails intact, yet the air stank of vinegar, sweat, and something sickly sweet beneath it. Names were carved into the walls of the cabins, some deep enough to splinter the wood, as if the crew tried to etch themselves into the ship before disappearing. Not a single body remained. When they tried to burn it, the brig groaned as though something still moved inside. And that was not even the worst part. The ship was breathing before anyone climbed aboard, not with sails or lungs, but with wood swollen by seawater and rot, exhaling a sour mist that drifted low across the surface like a held confession finally released. The air carried vinegar sharp enough to sting the eyes, layered with the stale heat of human bodies and a cloying sweetness beneath it. The scent of decay paused midway through its work. The brig drifted without oars, without calls or signals, its sails slack and stained, its flag hanging rigid as dried skin stretched too long in the sun. Around it, the Mediterranean lay unnaturally smooth, the water refusing to slap against the hull, as if even the sea hesitated to touch what this vessel contained. The patrol ship circled once, then again, each pass revealing details that made the stomach tighten. Barnacles clustered thick along the waterline, yet the ropes were intact, carefully knotted, untouched by storm or sabotage. Cargo hatches remained sealed, their iron clasps dull but unbroken. This was no wreck abandoned to chance. This was a ship that had been left deliberately, set adrift with intention, like an offering no one wished to claim. As the distance closed, the name on the stern came into view, or rather, its absence. Where letters should have been, there were only pale scars in the wood, scraped away unevenly, each groove shallow but desperate, as though fingers had worked until skin tore and nails split, determined to erase the last proof of belonging. When the boarding ladder scraped against the hull, the sound carried too far in the silence. The deck greeted them with warmth that did not belong to the late afternoon sun, boards slightly tacky beneath their boots, as if still damp with recent use. Crates of silk, sacks of spice, and barrels of wine were lashed in neat rows, undisturbed, their value untouched by any hand that might have saved itself by stealing. Between them, the planks were marked with long, wavering scratches that caught the light at certain angles, looping and intersecting like frantic handwriting. These were not the marks of cargo shifting in a storm. They followed no straight line, no practical path. They spoke of bodies dragged, of balance lost, of panic pressed flat against wood. The smell grew heavier with each step forward. Vinegar burned the throat, a cleansing agent used too late and too often, layered over the unmistakable musk of fear and illness. It clung to clothing, to hair, to the inside of the mouth. There were no flies, no birds perched on the rigging, no signs of scavengers. Life had approached this ship and recoiled. Even sound seemed reluctant to settle here, footsteps muffled, the creak of timber subdued, as if the brig absorbed noise the way it had absorbed sweat, breath, and suffering. Nothing moved, yet nothing felt empty. The ship did not feel abandoned. It felt paused, as though whatever had happened here had not ended, only stepped aside, waiting for witnesses. The first step onto the deck felt like trespass into a body that had not yet decided whether it was dead. The wood yielded slightly underweight, warm in a way that had nothing to do with sun or weather, as if heat had been trapped beneath the surface and could not escape. Every plank carried a dull sheen, darkened by old moisture that no amount of salt air had dried. The cargo stood in disciplined rows, crates of silk wrapped tight, spice chests sealed with wax, barrels braced with care that spoke of routine and order continuing long after reason should have collapsed. Nothing here had been scattered by panic or claimed by theft. Value had been preserved even as lives had not. Closer inspection revealed what distance had hidden. The planks between the cargo were scarred with long, uneven streaks, some shallow, others dug so deep they splintered the grain. They curved and crossed without pattern, looping back on themselves, stopping abruptly as if strength had failed mid-motion. These were not marks left by tools or ropes. They were the paths of fingernails dragged again and again across the same ground, hands searching for purchase where none existed. In places, the scratches clustered so tightly they resembled dark stains, the wood polished smooth by repeated contact, by desperation worn into muscle memory. The air burned the throat with each breath. Vinegar hung thick and sharp, its acrid sting overpowering at first, then giving way to deeper layers beneath it. There was the unmistakable animal heat of men who had sweated through fever, the sourness of vomit soaked into seams, the metallic edge of sickness that lingered long after bodies were gone. It was the smell of containment, of illness fought not with cure, but with ritual, with cleansing repeated until it became meaningless. Every breath tasted of effort expended too late. No corpses lay on the deck. No bones, no blood pooled between boards, no stains fresh enough to accuse. The absence pressed harder than any visible violence. A massacre would have made sense. Death laid out plainly could be counted, measured, mourned. Here there was only vacancy, an impression of bodies recently removed, as though the deck still remembered where weight had been distributed, where men had fallen, where knees had struck wood in prayer or collapse. The ship felt recently inhabited in the way an emptied room still holds warmth, still echoes with breath long after voices have stopped. The rigging hung slack, ropes stiff with salt and grime but neatly coiled, ends tucked away with the precision of sailors who still believed in tomorrow. Knots remained tight, hands that tied them steady enough to complete the task. This had not been sudden. Whatever unfolded here had taken time, enough time for habits to persist even as certainty dissolved. The wheel was lashed straight, the compass covered, the deck swept clean of loose debris. Someone had cared until the end, or until caring became the only thing left to do. The silence aboard the brig was not natural. It did not behave like the quiet of an empty ship abandoned to the sea. It felt compressed, held in place by the structure itself. Footsteps failed to echo properly, sound swallowed by wood and canvas, as though the ship absorbed noise the same way it had absorbed sweat and fear. Even the gulls kept their distance, circling wide, their cries fading before they reached the deck. The sea lapped softly at the hull but never slapped against it, refusing contact, maintaining a respectful distance. As the men moved forward, their boots left faint impressions that slowly faded, the wood springing back with unsettling patience. Near the main mast, darker stains pooled where moisture had gathered and never fully evaporated. The grain there was warped, swollen by repeated washings, vinegar poured again and again in desperate imitation of cleanliness. The mast itself bore marks where hands had gripped too long, fingerprints pressed into tar and salt, smoothed by repetition until they became part of the surface. Everywhere there were signs of human presence reduced to residue. A dropped cap wedged beneath a crate, stiff with dried sweat. A length of rope chewed and frayed where teeth had worried it absent-mindedly. A smear on the railing where a body had leaned, paused, then moved on. None of it told a complete story. Each detail hinted at motion interrupted, at decisions made under pressure that never quite resolved into conclusion. The absence of blood was perhaps the most unsettling detail of all. Fever left no dramatic evidence. It hollowed from within, drained strength quietly, reduced men to heat and breath and shaking hands. Whatever had happened here had not required violence between the living. It had required endurance, patience, and the slow erosion of certainty. The deck bore witness not to struggle against an enemy, but to the steady surrender of control. Standing there, surrounded by untouched wealth and invisible loss, it became impossible to believe the crew had fled in panic. There were no boats missing, no signs of a hurried escape. The ship had not been abandoned in fear. It had been emptied with intention, one body at a time, leaving behind everything that could not carry infection or memory. The brig felt less like a vessel and more like a container that had fulfilled its purpose, now waiting for the next phase of its journey. The deck did not creak in protest beneath unfamiliar weight. It accepted the newcomers without resistance, without welcome. The warmth persisted, rising faintly through leather soles, a reminder that the ship had not cooled yet, that whatever had animated it had only recently departed. Or perhaps had not departed at all, merely shifted deeper, pressed into seams and joints where it could not be seen. Nothing here demanded immediate explanation. Nothing announced itself as catastrophe. The ship offered no answers, only evidence arranged too neatly, too carefully, as though chaos had been managed to the last possible moment. The absence lingered, heavy and deliberate, making clear that this was not the aftermath of death, but the continuation of a process that had not yet decided it was finished. Below deck, the cabins told their story in fragments, the way memories surface when the body is already failing. The stairs descended into thicker air, each step downward tightening the chest, lantern light pressing against walls that seemed to lean inward by fractions too small to measure. The warmth intensified immediately, trapped heat clinging to skin, heavy and intimate, as though the lower deck had been sealed around living bodies and never properly reopened. The ship no longer smelled like a vessel at sea. It smelled like containment. Hammocks hung empty in their frames, canvas stretched and bowed as if weight had only recently been lifted. They swayed faintly, responding to movements above, preserving the rhythm of bodies that had slept, convulsed, and lain awake here listening to their own breath. Some hammocks bore darker stains where sweat had soaked through repeatedly, salt crystallized into the fabric, edges stiff and rough to the touch. Others were cleaner, barely used, suggesting men who had never made it below, or who had not been strong enough to climb back up once they descended. Beside the hammocks, bowls rested where they had been set down and forgotten. The gruel inside had dried into cracked, gray crusts, split open like parched earth. Spoons lay nearby, their handles worn smooth, some bent slightly out of shape by hands that had clenched too hard. No vermin had touched the food. The ship's isolation had preserved it in this suspended state, a meal eternally unfinished. Clothing had been folded and stacked with care at the foot of bunks, shirts aligned, trousers paired, boots placed heel to heel. This was not the chaos of panic. This was preparation, the quiet order of men who believed they would return to these things. The walls carried the most deliberate record. Names had been carved into the wood wherever space allowed, scratched into planks between beams, etched along door frames, scored into the undersides of shelves. Some were neat, letters formed slowly and carefully, each stroke measured as though the writer had time and control. Others were jagged, overlapping themselves, deepened by repetition until the wood splintered and peeled back. These names were not decorative. They were not idle graffiti. They were anchors. The act of writing, of cutting one's identity into the body of the ship, carried the weight of ritual, a declaration that the person had existed here, that they had not yet vanished entirely. Certain names appeared only once, isolated, untouched by later hands. Others were cut again and again, letters retraced until they blurred into grooves, the original form almost lost beneath desperation. In some places, names had been crossed out, not erased, but violently struck through, lines gouged so deeply the wood cracked. Nearby, new names appeared, layered over the old, a palimpsest of presence and loss. The walls had become a ledger that no one intended to read, a record created not for posterity, but for survival. The smell grew stronger the deeper one moved, vinegar sharp and persistent, but increasingly ineffective. Beneath it rose the copper tang of illness, unmistakable and intimate, the scent of fevered bodies and internal decay. It coated the tongue, lingered at the back of the throat, made breathing feel like participation rather than observation. The lantern light revealed a faint sheen on the boards, moisture beading and sliding slowly downward, as if the wood itself were perspiring. In the heat, the ship seemed to exhale, releasing waves of odor that ebbed and returned in slow pulses. Doors to smaller cabins stood open, hinges stiff, wood swollen by repeated washings. Inside, the spaces were cramped and low, ceilings close enough to press down on the shoulders. Beds were narrow, frames warped, mattresses permanently indented. In one cabin, a blanket had been carefully folded and placed at the head of the bed, as though saving the best part for later. In another, the fabric was shredded, torn by hands that had clutched and twisted until fibers gave way. These rooms did not suggest sudden death. They suggested waiting. Scratches marked the inside of several cabin doors, Long arcs etched where fingers had slid downward, stopped, then started again. Some marks were shallow, tentative. Others were deep and frantic, cutting across the grain at impossible angles. They did not align with the locks. They did not indicate attempts to escape. They were the gestures of bodies pressed too close to boundaries they could not change, movements made without plan, driven by heat, pain, and exhaustion. Personal effects remained where they had last been used. A small religious token lay on a shelf, worn smooth by handling. A knife rested in its sheath beneath a pillow, and used. A letter, never sealed, sat folded beside a bunk, ink faded where moisture had touched it. There was no evidence of violence between the crew. No blood spatter, no signs of struggle. Whatever choices had been made here had not been enforced by force. They had been agreed upon, or at least accepted, one by one. The lantern's flame flickered as air shifted, and shadows moved along the walls, catching on the carved names, deepening their grooves. In the low light, the letters seemed almost wet, as though freshly cut. The ship responded to observation in subtle ways. Boards creaked softly without movement. The air thickened and thinned without cause. Sound behaved strangely, footsteps muted, breathing amplified. It felt less like standing inside a structure and more like standing inside something that remembered being alive. At the far end of the lower deck, near the bow, the carvings became denser, names layered so thickly they merged into abstract patterns. Here, the smell was nearly overwhelming. Vinegar failed entirely, reduced to a faint sharpness beneath the heavy sweetness of decay. The floor was darker, stained by fluids that had soaked too deeply to ever be scrubbed away. This had been a gathering place. A final stage. The point at which separation between the sick and the not yet sick had ceased to matter. There were no bodies because the ship had not kept them. It had held them only long enough to be altered, reduced to heat and breath, and carved names, then released. The cabins bore witness to endurance rather than collapse. Every folded garment, every unfinished meal, every carefully carved letter spoke of men who believed survival was possible until the moment belief itself became another burden to shed. Below deck, the brig revealed its true cargo. Not silk or spice, not wine or metal, but the residue of human presence stripped of flesh. Memory pressed into wood, fear etched into grain, hope folded and set aside. The ship had not been abandoned in chaos. It had been methodically emptied, leaving behind a structure saturated with the act of living through something that did not permit escape, only continuation. The logbook was found sealed in oilcloth, tucked inside a locker that had been wedged shut with deliberate care, as though someone feared the sea more than fire or theft. The fabric crackled softly when it was unwrapped, releasing a faint, stale odor of tar and old hands. Not a single page showed signs of water damage. The ink had not run. The paper had not buckled. It was preserved with the same precision that had kept the cargo untouched, another object spared while its owners were not. The early entries were calm, methodical, written in a steady hand accustomed to routine. Weather conditions were noted, course corrected, supplies inventoried. The handwriting carried confidence, the kind that comes from repetition and familiarity, a man recording a journey he had made before and expected to make again. Then, gradually, without ceremony, the language shifted. A single line mentioned a sailor taken ill, described without alarm. Fever was not unusual. The sea bred sickness as readily as profit. Vinegar rations were increased. Bedding was aired. The tone remained controlled, almost dismissive, as though the act of writing could reduce the problem to scale. Day by day, the entries lengthened. More men were listed as unfit for duty, their names added beneath headings that grew crowded. Tasks were reassigned. Watches shortened. The log recorded increased use of vinegar and seawater washings, notes about scrubbing decks until the wood lightened, then darkened again with moisture. Skin irritation was mentioned in passing, hands cracked and bleeding from constant cleansing, but still the handwriting remained disciplined. This was an attempt to manage the uncontrollable through procedure. As the fever spread, the writing became denser, the margins filled with additions and corrections. The same names appeared repeatedly, first as mildly ill, then confined to bunks, then marked with short, clipped notations that avoided stating the obvious. Death was not named. It was implied through absence, through the quiet removal of duties, through the subtraction of rations. The logbook became less a record of navigation and more an accounting of attrition. At a certain point, the entries began to reference the sea not as environment, but as instrument. Notes described lowering linens into salt water, washing bodies with it, exposing the sick to open air on deck even when their strength failed. There was a growing conviction threaded through the writing, subtle but unmistakable, that the water itself possessed a corrective power. The sea had carried them this far. It would cleanse what the body could not. This belief did not arrive suddenly. It built slowly, reinforced by desperation and the failure of every other measure. The handwriting began to change. Letters leaned unevenly, lines wavered, ink blotted where the pen hesitated or pressed too hard. The entries grew shorter but more frequent, as if the act of writing had become a compulsion rather than a duty. The captain's authority faded from the text, replaced by collective language. Decisions were no longer issued. They were agreed upon. The log recorded meetings without detailing them, conclusions without explanation, as though justification had become unnecessary. Then came the shift that no longer tried to hide itself. The sea was described as final remedy. The words were careful, restrained, but their meaning was unmistakable. The sick, it was written, could not be allowed to remain below deck. Their presence endangered those not yet afflicted. Quarantine aboard a ship was impossible. Space was finite. Air was shared. The solution recorded was not framed as sacrifice, but as necessity, a medical measure carried out with solemn restraint. The first mention was indirect, a line noting that one man had been committed to the water for the good of the vessel. No further explanation followed. The next entry expanded on the practice, stating that those beyond recovery were to be lowered gently, wrapped to prevent distress. There was no mention of resistance, no description of struggle. The absence of detail suggested either restraint or an unwillingness to confront the reality of what was being done. As days passed, the language grew hollow. The same phrases were repeated, copied almost verbatim from earlier entries, as though originality itself had become exhausting. Names continued to disappear from the roster. The logbook no longer tracked progress toward port. It tracked only the process. Lowered, committed, cleansed. The sea, once a route, had become an endpoint. Eventually, the distinction between sick and healthy eroded. The logbook reflected this with subtle shifts in phrasing. Those showing signs were mentioned alongside those not yet displaying symptoms. Precaution replaced diagnosis. The fear of waiting overtook the hope of recovery. The writing recorded a grim logic. If the sea purified, delay only increased risk. Better to act early. Better to reduce uncertainty. The pen trembled more often now, ink pooling at the ends of words, but the entries continued. Near the end, dates ceased to appear. Time lost relevance when each day repeated the same act. The handwriting degraded further, letters collapsing inward, lines drifting upward or downward without regard for margins. The oilcloth around the logbook preserved these final pages, protecting them from the water they described so obsessively. The irony was unintentional, but sharp. The last entries no longer referenced individuals by name. They referred only to numbers, then to approximations, then to none at all. The act had become detached from identity. There was a brief notation about silence below deck, about the ship feeling lighter, about the air improving. This was followed by a pause in writing, several pages left blank, as though the person holding the pen had stepped away and not returned. The final entry was incomplete. It recorded preparation without execution. Ropes checked. Weight measured. Sea calm. The sentence broke off mid-line. Ink smeared where the pen had dragged without forming letters. There was no signature. No confirmation. No witness left to record what followed. The logbook ended not with closure, but with suspension, the written equivalent of a breath held too long. In the year 1721, when fear of plague haunted every port and rumor traveled faster than ships, the brig had become a self-contained tribunal. It had judged its own crew with the tools it understood, procedure, ritual, and the vast, indifferent authority of the sea. The logbook preserved the reasoning, but not the cost. It could explain how the decision was reached without ever justifying it. Reading it felt less like uncovering a crime and more like tracing a descent. Each page narrowed the range of possible outcomes until only one remained. By the time the last man was left to write, the choice had already been made so many times it no longer felt like a choice at all. The ship had not lost its crew to chaos or madness. It had lost them to consistency, to a belief repeated until it hardened into action. The logbook closed without ceremony, its oilcloth folded back into place, its contents intact. It had survived water, time, and fire. What it recorded had not. The sea had taken the bodies. The ship had taken the memory. And the book remained, a clean, dry record of a methodical erasure carried out one careful decision at a time. At dusk, as preparations were made to consign the vessel to fire, the sea altered its posture. The light thinned, stretched long across the water, and the horizon dimmed into a band of dull metal. It was then that the brig responded. Not with the snap of rigging or the sigh of wind through canvas, but with a deeper sound, a long internal creak that traveled up through the hull and into bone. The noise carried the character of settling, of redistribution, as if something within the ship had shifted and found its place again after a long absence. The smell changed first. Vinegar sharpened, its sting growing almost painful, layered suddenly with heat and dampness that had no source in the cooling air. The sweetness beneath it thickened, heavy and ripe, like breath held too long in a closed room. It rolled across the deck in slow waves, clinging to ankles and hems, rising toward the face with deliberate patience. The men felt it before they understood it, a pressure against the chest that made breathing conscious, measured, as though the air itself had become reluctant to move. The carved names along the deck and railings darkened as the light faded. Grooves that had appeared pale in the afternoon now looked freshly cut, their edges sharp, their depths black and wet. No tool touched them. No hand moved. Yet the letters seemed to assert themselves, catching the eye, pulling attention toward them with uncomfortable insistence. In places where names overlapped, the wood appeared bruised, as though struck from within. The ship was not displaying its history. It was revisiting it. Heat rose through the soles of boots, subtle at first, then unmistakable. It was not the heat of flame or sun. It was organic, intimate, the warmth of bodies remembered rather than present. The deck felt alive beneath weight, flexing in a way that suggested response rather than structure. Each step provoked a faint answer, a low vibration that traveled outward, connecting plank to plank, beam to beam, as though the ship were reacquainting itself with occupancy. The sea around the brig remained calm, but its stillness now felt intentional. Water lapped softly at the hull, never striking, never climbing, as if holding position by agreement. Reflections warped strangely along the sides of the vessel, the mirrored image of the brig stretching and compressing in ways that did not correspond to movement above. It looked, for brief moments, as though the ship below the surface carried more mass than the one visible in the air. As torches were brought closer, the ship emitted another sound, lower than before, a groan that traveled the length of the hull. It was not a protest. It was acknowledgement. The firelight flickered, shadows leaping across the deck and down into hatchways, where darkness pooled thickly. Within that darkness, something shifted. Not visibly, not yet, but perceptibly, a redistribution of presence that made the air feel crowded. The heat intensified. Sweat broke along spines despite the cooling evening. Breath fogged faintly in front of faces, then vanished, swallowed quickly by the thickening atmosphere. The smell of vinegar now carried a metallic edge, sharp and unmistakable, the scent of blood remembered rather than spilled. It clung to the tongue, refused to dissipate. The ship had absorbed too much to be neutral. It had been saturated with fear, breath, and intention, each layer pressed into grain and seam until the distinction between material and memory collapsed. The understanding arrived slowly, unwelcome and undeniable. The brig had not been emptied. It had been filled. Each body lowered into the sea had left something behind, not weight but imprint. Sweat soaked into planks. Breath condensed in corners. Panic carved into walls. The act repeated often enough, with enough conviction, had altered the vessel's internal balance. The ship had learned what it carried. The creaking resumed, rhythmic now, a slow cycle of tension and release. Lanterns swayed without being touched. Shadows gathered along bulkheads, thickening into shapes that suggested volume without form. Names carved below deck seemed to whisper against one another, not audibly, but through vibration, through pressure changes that made the ears ache and the jaw tighten. The ship was not haunted in the way stories preferred. It was occupied. As the first torch touched wood, flame hesitated. The fire took reluctantly, creeping along grooves and seams rather than leaping. Smoke rose thick and sour, carrying the full weight of the ship's accumulated scent. The heat below the deck surged in response, as though the vessel recognized threat and answered it with resistance. Boards popped and cracked, not from flame but from internal stress, the sound of a structure adjusting to preserve itself. The carved names flared briefly as firelight passed over them, shadows sharpening their edges. In that moment, it became impossible to tell which grooves were old and which were new. The ship's surface had become an active record, revising itself, deepening certain marks, obscuring others. Identity was no longer fixed. It shifted with attention, with proximity, with the act of witnessing. The brig groaned again, louder now, a sound that carried through the hull and into the water. Ripples spread outward, slow and concentric, distorting reflections, bending the line between ship and sea. The water responded, not with violence, but with accommodation, rising slightly along the hull, as if attempting to cradle rather than extinguish. The fire fought for purchase, flames flickering uncertainly, smoke rolling back across the deck. In the glow of firelight, the deck appeared crowded, not with forms that could be named or counted, but with density, a sense of occupied space that resisted intrusion. Movement felt constrained, as though walking through a room already filled. Each step seemed to displace something unseen, provoking subtle shifts in temperature and sound. The ship asserted its claim, not aggressively, but with the certainty of something that had been shaped by repetition. The realization settled with a weight heavier than fear. The brig had been transformed through use. Not by trade, not by voyage, but by ritual. The repeated act of lowering bodies into the sea had not emptied the vessel. It had consecrated it. The ship had become a container for what the sea refused to keep, a place where presence accumulated rather than dispersed. As flames finally took hold, spreading with more confidence, the ship responded with a final, deep settling motion. The heat beneath the deck surged one last time, rising through wood and iron, pressing against soles and bones. It was not the heat of fire alone. It was the remembered warmth of many bodies gathered too closely, the echo of breath in enclosed spaces, the residue of life forced into decision. The brig burned slowly, reluctantly, each beam surrendering only after prolonged insistence. Smoke carried the scent far across the water, a signal without meaning to any who might catch it. As the structure weakened, the creaking softened, replaced by a low, continuous sound that might have been wind or might have been release. When the hull finally gave way and the ship slipped beneath the surface, the sea closed over it with careful restraint, barely disturbed. The water smoothed itself quickly, returning to calm. Fire died. Smoke thinned. Yet the warmth lingered, faint but present, rising from the surface long after the last visible fragment disappeared. The brig had gone down, but it had not been erased. It had been transferred, its cargo redistributed once more, carried not in bodies or goods, but in the sea itself, which now held more than it had agreed to accept. Fire took the sails first, climbing the canvas with deliberate hunger, reducing months of wind and labor to collapsing ash. The flames traced the rigging, ran along ropes stiff with salt, and dropped sparks onto the deck below, where they caught in the carved grooves as if the names themselves were fuel. Each letter flared briefly, illuminated one final time, shadows deepening their cuts so that they appeared freshly made. The ship did not thrash or resist with violence. It endured. Its groans were low and prolonged, the sound of strain rather than panic, as though it were weighing the cost of surrender. The deck burned unevenly. Some planks blackened and split at once, while others smoldered stubbornly, refusing to catch despite direct flame. Smoke rose thick and sour, carrying the layered stench of vinegar, rot, and something warmer beneath, a trace of human presence that refused to be consumed. The heat radiated outward, not just upward, pressing into the surrounding air, warping it. Even as the fire strengthened, the brig seemed to draw inward, beams tightening, hull compressing, holding fast to what had been pressed into it over weeks of fear and repetition. As the hull finally began to fail, the sound changed. The creaking gave way to a long, continuous moan that traveled from bow to stern, a vibration felt through the water more than heard. The ship was not breaking apart so much as releasing pressure, yielding inch by inch. When the first section gave way and water rushed in, steam erupted in violent bursts, the collision of fire and sea-producing clouds that briefly obscured the vessel entirely. For a moment, it seemed as though the brig might linger in that space between states, neither burning nor sinking, suspended by the sheer weight of what it contained. Then the sea claimed it. The stern dipped, the bow lifted slightly, and the ship slid beneath the surface with reluctant grace. Flames hissed and vanished. Smoke thinned rapidly. The water closed over the hull without spectacle, without churn or froth, smoothing itself as if nothing had passed through. The surface returned to its earlier calm, the unnatural stillness restored. Only a faint warmth lingered, radiating upward, dissolving slowly into the cooling night. Silence followed, complete and unnerving. The absence of sound felt heavier than the fire had been. There was no debris floating, no wreckage to mark the loss. The brig had not broken apart. It had been taken whole. The water held its shape, reflecting stars with deceptive clarity, as though it had accepted the ship without comment or consequence. In the days that followed, the patrol carried on, the incident recorded and sealed away, another measure taken against contagion in a year already thick with fear. Yet the sea did not forget as readily as paper. Within weeks, reports began to circulate among ports scattered along the Mediterranean coast. Sailors spoke of a familiar smell drifting in with the tide on calm mornings, sharp with vinegar and sweet beneath, arriving without warning and vanishing just as quickly. It clung to docks and nets, to hulls newly arrived, to the hems of coats, leaving behind unease rather than illness. Fishermen were the first to notice resistance below the surface. Nets snagged on nothing visible, lines pulled taut against unseen weight. When hauled up, the ropes bore shallow cuts, parallel grooves scored into fiber and wood alike. Some swore they could feel warmth through the handles of their tools, a faint pulse that faded once the gear was lifted clear of the water. No wreckage was ever recovered. No identifiable timber surfaced. The sea offered no proof, only sensation. In one port, a diver was sent down to inspect a suspected obstruction near a shipping lane. He returned shaken, unable to describe what he had encountered, only that the water felt crowded, that his lamp revealed shapes where none should be, surfaces too smooth to be rock and too broad to be hull. He refused to descend again. His account was dismissed, attributed to poor light and poorer nerves, but the lane was quietly abandoned. Names began to appear, not carved into wood this time, but impressed into tar along wharves, etched faintly into the sides of small boats where they rested overnight. They were incomplete, fragmented, often overlapping, letters pressed deep enough to resist scraping. No one could trace them to crew lists or port records. Some appeared only once. Others returned in different harbors, altered slightly, as though the act of writing were being practiced. The smell accompanied these marks, arriving ahead of storms, lingering after calm. It did not bring sickness. That was perhaps the most unsettling aspect. It was harmless, inert, a reminder without consequence. The fear it provoked had no outlet, no corrective action. Burning another ship would not remove it. Quarantine could not contain it. The sea had absorbed the brig's cargo and redistributed it, not as bodies or disease, but as memory pressed into movement. Merchants learned to recognize the signs. Crews reported odd sensations beneath their feet, a subtle warmth in the deck on certain nights, a low vibration felt rather than heard when passing through specific stretches of water. These reports were not recorded officially. They lived in margins, in letters sent home, in tavern stories told without conviction. The sea was vast. It could accommodate many explanations. Yet routes shifted. Certain lanes were avoided. Superstition took the place of reason where reason offered no comfort. By the end of the year 1721, the incident of the drifting brig had faded from formal record. Trade resumed its patterns. Fear found new objects. But the Mediterranean retained a residue, an undercurrent of unease that surfaced unpredictably. The sea carried more than salt and current now. It carried a lesson pressed into it by repetition and desperation. The brig had been destroyed as required. Fire had taken it. Water had sealed it away. By every measure that mattered to law and health, the problem had been resolved. Yet the outcome resisted that conclusion. The ship had not been emptied of its burden. It had been multiplied. Each vessel that crossed the waters it had entered felt a trace of it, a subtle pressure that reminded wood and iron of what they could be made to hold. Some nights, when the sea lay too calm and the air carried that familiar scent, sailors found themselves touching the rails of their ships without knowing why, fingers tracing grain and seam, as if checking for marks not yet there. They felt, briefly, the suggestion of names waiting for a surface willing to remember them. The sea did not force this upon them. It merely offered the conditions. Fire had erased the brig's shape. Water had dispersed its substance. What remained required neither. It persisted as inclination, as warmth, as the quiet certainty that vessels were not neutral things. They learned. They absorbed. And once filled with enough fear and breath and intention, they did not readily let go.